Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. I'm Alejandro de la Fuente. I direct the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at the Hawkins Center for African and African American Research. On behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., who is on his way to Africa to do some filming there, and that's why he couldn't be here, and on behalf of the Hawkins Center for African and African American Research, it is my great honor and my pleasure to introduce Professor Ben Vinson III, a renowned scholar of Latin American history and one of the key figures in the study of colonial Mexico and Afro-Mexico. Now, Ben Vinson is coming back to his family, as it were, because he's no stranger either here at Harvard or to the Hawkins Center. In 2010, Ben participated in Black in Latin America, the important conference convened by Skip Gates at Harvard, where dozens of scholars working all over Latin America came together. It was in some ways a foundational conference. We are planning, by the way, on following up and doing a Black in Latin America too in 2018. Along with other scholars, including his friend and colleague Herman Bennett, they came here to Harvard in 2010 to talk about something that was not even a subject then, and that was the Black presence in Mexico, an improbable place, right? The Black in Latin America conference marked a new beginning of sorts for the Huggins Lectures. I was telling Ben that we Latin Americans have colonized the Huggins Lectures now, which had its mandate from the beginning to bring key scholars in the field of African American studies, African American history. But the American was typically defined as just the United States. What the Black in Latin America conference showed in stark relief was that the African diasporic history was by no means limited to just the United States. And just as the conference showcased how vast a field this is, so did the Huggins Lecture series open up to include African history in the Americas as a whole. So since 2012, the Huggins Lectures has welcomed key figures in the study of Afro-Latin America and the Caribbean. George Reed Andrews, Rebecca Scott, Franklin Knight, Jane Landers, and most recently, David Geggus. I think those prominent scholars are in very good company as we welcome Ben Vinson to Harvard. Professor Vinson is the Dean of the Columbian College of Arts and Sciences at the George Washington University. In assuming the position in 2013, Professor Vinson became the university's youngest academic leader and its only Black dean. I understand that you've been doing amazing work at the school. We have read about the Corcoran School of the Arts and Design, which allows the college to be a key player in creative and innovative arts education. Prior to joining the George Washington University, Professor Vinson was the Herbert Baxter Adams Professor of Latin American History at Johns Hopkins University, where he also served as the founding director of the Center for Africana Studies and as Vice Dean for Centers, Interdepartmental Programs, and Graduate Programs at Johns Hopkins School of Arts and Sciences. Professor Vinson received his PhD from Columbia University and his bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College. As a historian of Latin America and the African diaspora, he has taught and written on colonial Latin America, slavery, the African presence in colonial Mexico, Blacks in the colonial Mexican militia, African American experiences in Mexico, and Afro-Mexican experiences in general. His various important books include Bearing Arms for His Majesty, The Free-Colored Militia in Colonial Mexico. I think this is the book that allowed all of us to know Ben Vinson's work, published by Stanford University Press in 2003. A second book, Flight, The Story of Virgil Richardson, a Tuskegee Airman in Mexico, published by Palgrave in 2004 and reissued in 2012. And Afro-México, El Pulso de la Población Negra en México, una historia recordada, olvidada y vuelta a recordar, published in 2005 and co-authored by Bobby Bone. He's also the co-editor with Matthew Restall of Black Mexico, Race and Society from Colonial to Modern Times, a book that was published in 2009 and that I used in one of my classes in a seminar on race and ethnicity in Latin America. You may all have read in the news that just a few months ago, the Mexican Population Survey, for the first time, gave respondents the possibility to identify themselves as Blacks or as people of African descent. You may also have read that the survey found that about 1.4 million Mexicans, that's about 1.2% of the total population, chose to self-identify in terms of their African ancestry. The decision to include an Afro or a Black category in this population surveys is a major step towards recognizing the country's Black population, many of whom are, of course, descendants of slaves forcibly removed from Africa during the height of the Atlantic slave trade, and many of whom disappeared for decades under Mexico's celebrated culture of Mestizaje. Such recognition came after much work from Afro-Mexican community activists who petitioned national leaders and organized for recognition. What I want to say is that Ben Vinson's work has been very much part of that struggle, to which he has made fundamental contributions. He is one of only a handful of scholars who have constantly reminded us that Mexico was once a major destination for the Atlantic slave trade and the recipient of about 1 million African slaves during its colonial period. Before being mestizo, Ben has been telling us tirelessly, Mexico was not only indigenous, it was also African. So it is probably fitting that Dean Vinson's Huggins Lectures are titled Before Mestizaje, Race, Mixture, and Caste in Mexico. Please join me in welcoming Professor Vinson to Harvard.
Thank you. Alejandro, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I've got to say that's the best introduction I've ever had, and summing up a lot of aspects of my career, some of my decanal work, a lot of the things that I've been trying to do over the years. You've summed it up in ways I can go home. Thank you so much. But listen, everyone, thank you for coming out today. I'm not sure, is this working? Okay, great. It's really good to be back here at Harvard to deliver the Huggins Lectures on this particular topic because actually this is a project that actually began at Harvard about 14 years ago, almost to the day. And I keep this picture, this is a poster of a conference that was held by Bernard Balin, his Atlantic History Seminar, which I had the good fortune of attending. I keep it here framed in my office as a reminder that I need to get the book done on this particular project. But the topic of discussion that day was the Latin American caste system. And as is usual and customary for these lectures that typically go on castes, it was replete with captivating images taken from an exquisite series of caste paintings that were produced in Latin America during the colonial period. Now, many of us in the field, I'm not going to go deeply into those caste paintings today or throughout the course of my lectures. I'm going to be referring back and forth to them during the lectures. But many of us in the field use these paintings to help students visualize what may seem strange, to help make intelligible the vast range of racial mixture that demarcated difference in colonial Latin America. Now, for those of us in the United States who see these paintings, especially those for the first time, these paintings help us to grapple with understanding the difference between a fluid and multi-layered conception of race, which existed in colonial Latin America and to some extent even into modern Latin America, as opposed to, in our North American framework, are somewhat more staid, stationary views that are even becoming more complicated, admittedly, as time goes on. So there became a point in the lecture, and the lecture was delivered by Stuart Schwartz, a historian from Yale, where those who were less familiar with the complexities of Latin American history began to smile. Others looked at some of these images in disbelief. As we moved from mestizos to moriscos to lobos, coyotes, and ultimately to the salto para atrás, it seemed obvious. There was a point where history crossed the line, becoming visual fiction. I'm going to show just a couple of these slides to see what this is all about. So in this particular picture, you see the Alvarado married to an India. Alvarado, I'm still not exactly sure what that refers to, but in this particular union, it produces a Cachimborreta Alvarado. So this is a very, very interesting mixture, which I have not found, by the way. A no te entiendo con India is a torno atrás. So the no te entiendo, I don't understand what you are, mixed with an Indian is the turn backwards category. So you can begin to see, even I see smiles in the room. That was the very reaction. that is the $1 million reaction.
Because I understand some Spanish.
Yes, and so.
Yes.
Now that reaction was not my reaction. Having recently completed a book on the free-colored militias in Mexico, the lecture made me recall that I had seen several of the categories that were flashed on the screen in bodies of documents that were tucked away in the Mexican archives in Mexico City. Lobos, for instance, the mixture of India with negro, Indian and black. Moriscos, who are the mixture of the, well, there's various types of mixture, but you can also mix a mulatto with an Indio to get a Morisco. Coyotes, who are the mixture of an Indio with a mestizo. And Chinos, which I don't have a representation of. These in particular were very familiar to me. From what I had encountered in the record was full of these categories. I reconciled right then and there, 14 years ago, that I would begin to write a social history, bringing what I was calling at that point forgotten castes back to life, to help round out the historical record. The militia book also led me to believe that, perhaps more than fiction, it might be possible that these groups had an identity, that they lived their lives as such, that there were avenues to exploring a hidden history here. Now the project would be quick, so I thought, and the methodology easy. Collect everything that could be had in the archives on the topic. It's a very classic historical methodology. Understand the different domains of existence for these groups and tell their story. Maybe it'd be an article, maybe it'd be a book. But what I did not completely understand at the time is that these groups were more than just lives. In the way that these categories were utilized in the colonial records, there was a greater story. It was a story about legacies, about footprints, about patterns, about how the categories impacted the very system of caste organization, and even possibly established precedents, faint that they may be, for later, grander conceptualizations of racial order. These forgotten castes, what I now call extreme castes, represented the limits of colonial racial mixture and therefore offered clues into the next phase, more modern phase of racial metamorphosis. Could it be that in these groups there were lessons for the future? For unlocking hidden registers of Mestizaje itself? This is a representation of Mestizaje, which is in Mexico City, just a testament to how important this ideology is. Mestizaje, of course, has been a prevailing and dominant Latin American discourse that has for so long extolled the essential character of the region, conveying that the region's deep racial mixture has created conditions ripe for racial democracy, where racism and discrimination are different, even non-existent, or at best faintly detectable in modern nation states. Did this narrative and ideology emanate from the Baroque, complex racial landscape of colonial times? A landscape that was perhaps the antithesis of Mestizaje itself. Now, I'm not going to take up this topic specifically over the course of my lectures, but you may want to keep it in the back of your minds. It is also the topic that informs the book. But it is even possible, too, that nestled within Latin America's story of race, there are also clues to a broader North American racial future. as we are undergoing a hemispheric convergence, melding racial pasts into a commingled present. For now, let me tell my story by leaping back to the earliest moments of encounter in the New World. From the dawn of Spain's American empire to the end of its colonial regime, Spanish America was gripped by an almost innate need to process, to categorize, and label human differences in a way to manage its vast empire. Whether it was conquistadors seeking to establish gradients of difference between themselves and native rulers, or whether it was artisans striving to distinguish themselves amongst peers. People paid careful attention to what others looked like, how they lived, what they wore, and how they behaved. I'm going to just show you a few typical dress, slides of typical dress from Mexico. These are admittedly taken, drawn in the 1800s, but they echo back to the colonial period. What you're looking at is the classic dress of an hacendado or proprietor. What you're looking at is the particular dress of someone who is, well, this is someone of the faith, a man of the cloth. And there was also, by region in Mexico, you could identify yourself by your dress. And so this is the classic woman of Tehuantepec, actually a native woman rendition. So again, Mexico, as in other parts of Latin America, were full of these types of codes, the ways in which information was conveyed in the physical body and in the garments that people wore. Now, over time, rules were created to contain transgressions. Costumes and masks were soundly discouraged from being worn outside of sanctioned events and holidays, lest disguises lead to crimes, immorality, mistaken identity. One can imagine a masked man doing all kinds of damage and no one knowing who it is. That was horrible in the colonial period, as it is now. People who lived as others could be labeled criminals, and those who moved across color boundaries to enjoy privileges not associated with their caste did so at their own risk and peril. When legislation failed to control behavior, peer pressure impelled obedience and conformity. Yet within this world that craved identity fixity, the truth was that there was great fluidity. It was seen almost everywhere. In the early days of the conquest, as native regimes collapsed and tumbled, imposters rapidly ascended into the ranks of a vanishing native nobility. Along the frontiers and in urban centers, skilled and crafty pretenders found entry into professions for which they were never intended. Across the colonies, mulattoes became priests, blacks became silversmiths, plebeians of various racial hues became politicians and landowners of renown, some petty criminals became native lords. And a central catalyst behind the predicament was rampant racial mixture, which represented one of the most damaging realities of colonial life to the construction of orderly society, at least from the view of the crown, the king. Quite simply, from the perspective of the government, from the perspective of the elite, the proliferation of new racial groups presented concrete problems for transferring social privileges, for defining social station. This was a special concern for the Spaniards, since almost right after the conquest, what we categorize today as race became a means of dividing the spoils. Buttressed by a sense of elevated technological, military, moral, intellectual, and cultural superiority, white Spaniards felt entitled to extracting the best that the New World had to offer. Spaniards marked themselves as gente de razón, literally meaning people of reason, able to make rational decisions. More importantly, gente de razón were indelibly touched by the Christian faith. On the other hand, the indigenous population was deemed to be marked by an inherent inferiority. Now, it did not take long for these ideas to translate into a social system, the dual republic system, which subdivided the New World into a republic of Spaniards and a republic of Indians. Based loosely upon the social principles of late medieval Spain, where society was organized into an estate system, according to hereditary relationships around land. Some recognize this as the classic landowner-serf dichotomy. The dual republic system aspired to transplant the hierarchies of the old world onto the emerging racial landscape of the Americas. Indians were to become almost akin to the serfs of Europe, while whiteness was to become a marker of noble status. The republic system was not solely to be realized in a juridical sense. It had spatial implications. Early Spanish-American planners, urban planners, developed the concept of traza, in which whites were to be physically separated from the masses of Indians. An excellent example comes from early Mexico City. Now here, shortly after the defeat of the Aztecs, the Spanish population was housed within the confines of 13 city blocks. It's a little bit more in this picture. It's a little bit later than right after the conquest. Now, located in the center of these trazas was a plaza, and this organization would radiate and become very important to the construction of cities throughout Latin America. Now, this traza in Mexico was founded directly on top of the old capital city under the indigenous rule, the Aztec rule of Tenochtitlan. Outside of this nucleus, the indigenous population was assigned to live in 4 barrios, or neighborhoods, roughly aligned to the cardinal points of the traza. The traza's architect, Alonso Garcia Bravo, duplicated his plans in Oaxaca, and other trazas came into being shortly thereafter. Again, the patterning of urban space along these lines was not merely an important cleave for the colonial population, but it also served as a vehicle for apportioning privileges. Clustered around the plaza were the primary buildings of colonial government and religious authority. The plaza itself was to be the hub of urban commerce, which was then tied into a web of regional trade networks. By physically locating the white population in close proximity to these structures, symbolic statements were made as to who possessed true economic, political, and moral power in the colonies. Quite simply, it was Spaniards, not Indians, who were conceived as having the greatest facility and access to instrumental colonial institutions. However, even within the traza, there was gradation, so that the wealthiest and most important magnates were located nearest to the plaza center, while lesser Spaniards inhabited the traza's fringes. Now, the republic system was further conceived as a means of protecting Indians from the abusive colonists. A cadre of moral thinkers and colonial bureaucrats feared that extended contact with Spaniards accentuated the impact of the horrendous demographic decline that gripped the New World. They believed that local estate owners overworked Indios, thereby diverting them from the tasks that were needed for their own self-sustenance. Perhaps most importantly, such work diverted these native populations from being able to pay taxes, paying tribute to the king. Prolonged contact with Spaniards also encouraged in the mind of these thinkers looser morals. Colonists were deemed quick to seduce or invite Indians to engage in activities that prevented them from achieving their true spiritual potential. Consequently, both bureaucrats and clergymen sought to separate Indians and Spaniards, especially in the 16th century. And for the clergy, separation facilitated the project of spiritual conversion. For the king and the crown, separation offered the chance to enhance revenue streams that flowed into the royal treasury. Perhaps the main problem with the republic system was that it was predicated upon the persistence and vigilance of racial purity. But almost from the outset, miscegenation was occurring. The lack of Spanish women in the early colonies certainly played a role. Between 1509 and 1539, women represented just 5 to 6% of white immigrants to the Spanish Indies. Even as the colonies matured, white female immigration remained low, so that by the 1560s and 70s, just under a third of all white immigrants were women. Their dearth placed stress upon the reproductive capacity of the Republic of Spaniards, since this republic could not completely replicate itself without some cross-racial contact. A number of colonists took Indians as brides. 3 out of every 4 men did so in the Mexican city of Puebla in 1600. Others flushed with the sense of entitlement that they beheld through the conquest, chose to sexually exploit native women. Either way, mixture rapidly became a reality. These points, of course, say nothing of Africans entering the colonial landscape. Blacks were part of the earliest expeditions of conquest, serving as soldiers, auxiliaries, cooks, servants. You see in the middle of this picture Juan Garrido, the manservant of Cortés. He is sometimes known as a black conquistador. As early as the 1510s, 15 teens, African slaves were being brought to work in the Caribbean in small numbers. However, it was truly between 1529 and 1521, and 1639, when the conquest of Mexico and Peru, with those conquests, that Africans then began pouring into the New World. As the indigenous population declined due to the effects of disease, blacks came to work on estates along the coasts of Mexico and Peru. Sugar and viticulture were two particular arenas of black labor concentration. But additionally, blacks were instrumental as miners in the heydays of the silver boom. In urban areas also, blacks became indispensable as artisans and domestic laborers, and while the exact number of Africans who entered the Spanish colonies is still a matter of debate, this is being tossed around. We've got great numbers, but they're still being refined. As Alejandro mentioned, we have over 1 million peoples of African descent entering Mexico throughout the colonial period, and certainly over 200,000 entered the entire Americas by roughly the early 1600s. Nearly 50,000 in that early period were recorded working in Mexico. Again, these numbers I should not make light of them, and you should not make light of them. They represented tremendous numbers, especially given the small size of white population that was trickling in at the time. And blacks, as you can imagine, began to rapidly intermingle with other colonial populations. Now, as they intermingled with other populations, the patterns were somewhat different than the patterns that were found between whites and Indians. The slave-gender imbalance, combined with the relative inaccessibility of white women for peoples of African descent during this period, meant that much of the early miscegenation that blacks were engaged in this period took place between free Indian women and also mestizas. So these were the primary targets, at least in the Mexican case, of black males who comprised the majority of the black slave element. For the few African women who were transported to the Spanish holdings, they engaged in miscegenation with their masters, frequently by force. Now, atop black forced migration came sprinkles of immigration from Asia. Acapulco, which is right here in this area. This map also shows some of the major arenas where African labor was prominent in the 1500s and into the early 1600s. You have what I call the Silver Triangle up in the northern reaches of New Spain. You have a sugar zone in the area of Veracruz, and then you have a mixed cotton, cattle, and ranching area south of Mexico on the coast, just outlining Acapulco. But Acapulco, where the laser's pointing now, was a main point of trade for the Manila galleons that carried merchandise from the Orient and also brought streams of immigrants, especially from the Philippines and also from India. While some of these individuals came voluntarily, others arrived as slaves, supplementing the West African workforce. The Oriental slave trade was largely illegal, undergirded with complicated legislative twists. Until definitive actions were taken to abolish Asian slavery at the end of the 17th century, especially 1672, should be a date that is stamped in your mind for Asian slavery. Especially prior to that period, the trade managed to import between 60 to 300 individuals a year. Asians, who were collectively known as chinos, were typically sold at a great profit, but at cheaper price points than Africans, and this made them doubly welcomed in the Americas. A particularly intense period of trade transpired between 1580 to 1640. This should be recognized to some of you as the period of the union of the crowns of Portugal and Spain. In all, as many as 40,000 to 60,000 free and enslaved chinos entered New Spain alone during the colonial period. Many became peddlers in petty goods. Some were barbers, others were fishermen, construction workers, militiamen, agricultural workers. And as seen here in this slide, which is actually, again, taken from the 19th century, some were able to achieve a measure of grand status and wealth in Mexico over time. Now, given that barbers were also using their skills as surgeons in colonial times, there were a number of Asian, quote-unquote, physicians who were able to, of course, were very skillful with scissors. What may be most striking for our purposes was that Asians, and specifically Filipinos, could become members of the Indian neighborhoods. So this is to say that they actually joined pueblos and barrios that were targeted for the native population. What I think is that through this practice, then, the Asians were retrofitted into the dual republic system as indigenous peoples of the Spanish Empire. In cities like Acapulco, in Puebla, Mexico City, and elsewhere, it was not uncommon to find Asian immigrants who were recorded as Indios Manilos, or Indians of Manila, Indios Filipinas, or Indians from the Philippines, or Indios Chinos, or Chinese Indians, or more generally, Indians from the Orient. Africans, Asians, Native Americans, and Europeans comprised the foundation upon which the New World racial mixture would occur. These groups were deeply complex themselves, given that ethnicity produced seemingly endless varieties of population substrands. Obviously, while the predominant European population in the Spanish Empire hailed from the Iberian Peninsula, there were other immigrant streams as well from places like France and England, Italy, the Netherlands, and Germany. Similarly, the term Indios, a term that was partially invented for administrative convenience, was in truth an ethnic invention, a term that fused together various indigenous New World populations into a manageable category for record keeping. In everyday practice, not all Spaniards adopted the term of Indio. They understood its limitations as a descriptor. In certain frontier settings, what we recognize today as the U.S. Southwest, which was, of course, part of Mexico, Indio was used by Spaniards to refer mainly to a broadly Hispanicized native population. More specific, but not necessarily precise nomenclature was used to identify discrete groups: Pima, Otomi, Mapuche, Apache, etc. Africans, meanwhile, Mapuche, of course, being not in Mexico. Africans, meanwhile, through the jumbling that occurred in their journey across the Atlantic during the Middle Passage, also came to the New World in variegated fashion. This is deeply well studied. Despite the many ships which brought groups of individuals from regions that had deep familiarity with each other, creating a form of ethnic clustering that enabled some cross-communication and the preservation of certain African traditions. Another reality, of course, was that the New World also produced new amalgamations of African populations that had never been seen before, and some of these identities were structured while in transit. Again, these are well-studied topics. Similar phenomena could be observed among Chinos crossing the Pacific. They not only represented an amalgam of East and Southeast Asian populations, but they also represented small numbers of East Africans who had migrated to the Philippines, who had migrated to India before entering the New World. By the 1700s, in parts of New Spain, it became also vogue to use the term Chino to categorize individuals who were mixed with Native American ancestry and African ancestry. Hence, it was clear that Chino had come to mean several things. A person from the Orient, a person who looked like someone from the Orient, or someone brown. An individual who possessed a mixture of black and native ancestry. And here you're looking at a China Cambuja, mixture of black and Indian. Ethnic differences added culture as yet another hurdle that was facing administrators who were trying to generate common ties and affinities to unite the disparate peoples of their empire. Although their endgame was not true homogenization, administrators did seek to create enough cultural bridges to foster fluid imperial operations, fluid financial linkages, and a level of harmony that would minimize violent outbreaks of rebellion and resistance amongst their subjects. Interestingly, racial mixture was a tool in this effort. Think about it. The raw physical acts of miscegenation, or racial mixture, constituted the archetype of cross-cultural contact. Theoretically speaking, miscegenation could unite individuals who were distant across racial, cultural, and ethnic spectrums, bringing into being new peoples and new hybrid cultures forged from new shared experiences. In a nutshell, skin color, lineage, place of residence, place of birth, geographic mobility, these elements and more compounded the already bewildering task facing the Spanish imperial government on how to best create that orderly society that we talked about in the very beginning. Major metropolitan centers and ports became magnets for attracting some of the broadest form of population complexity, becoming natural sites for racial and ethnic fusion to occur. In no uncertain terms, the dual republic system could not withstand the rapid changes that were occurring to the colonial population. At stake was the structure of white privilege. Indeed, what did white privilege mean when the legitimate son of or daughter of a colonial magnate was racially mixed? How was white privilege to be transferred? Or should it be transferred in the case of a child like this? Did the introduction of white admixture elevate the pedigree of offspring, allowing for transcendence above baser traits? Those traits that were frequently associated with non-whites? Could legitimacy serve to override negative racial characteristics? Or were the mixed children of legitimate unions the social equals of those who were not? What about the social station of the parentage? Was a child born to an Indian governor's daughter and a white noble significantly superior to that born to a white artisan and a slave? If so, why? And how was the difference to be communicated socially? How was it to be communicated legislatively? In the first decade of the 16th, in the early decades of the 16th century, rather than dealing directly with the full implications of racial mixture in some of these questions directly, colonial bureaucrats and residents routinely sought to ignore many of the thorniest issues involved with these questions. When a Spaniard fathered, or much more likely mothered, a child with an Indian, a decision was made as to whether to recognize the child as legitimate or not. Children who were not recognized would be raised in an indigenous world, in indigenous communities. Here, they would adopt indigenous customs, worldviews, and language. In effect, these mixed children would become Indians. And that concept is captured here in a mural by Diego Rivera. On the other hand, if the children were recognized as legitimate by their white parent, they would be socialized as white, and the fact of their race mixture would be overlooked. One of the sons of Juan Cano and Isabel Montezuma, which was the daughter of the last ruling Aztec king, was one such child. Isabel Montezuma was well known as being one of the prototypical mothers of Mestizaje. She mothered a long lineage of racially mixed children, mestizos, some of which became rather prominent. One of them, indeed, after he was recognized and was raised, proceeded to become one of the colony's most influential members of the white Creole nobility in the 1500s. Colonial authorities didn't have any problems with this practice in the early days. In fact, they encouraged these practices. The mixed progeny of white aristocrats fortified the ruling classes by increasing their head count. During the early days, the number of whites, actual or honorary, they were deemed a valuable resource in the project of implementing Spanish governance. However, a series of mid-16th century conspiracies and rebellions that were launched by these Creoles, and when we mean Creole in this context, we're talking about people born in the New World, typically white. These Creoles and mestizos, this mestizo elite, these individuals who were actually of mixed race heritage, but were sometimes recognized as white. Conspiracies by this particular sector helped change the perspective and the common practice of socializing these individuals as whites. The new attitude towards racial mixture began to emerge gradually between the 1540s and the 1570s. It was at this time when the term mestizo began appearing with more frequency, becoming virtually synonymous with illegitimacy. The new attitude in racial nomenclature coincided with some other changes, too, that were taking place in colonial society. In the specific context of Mexico, the year 1563 marked a coup attempt. Disgruntled estate owners who participated in the conquest had become disaffected over time, since the colonial government had increasingly reduced their privileges and their opportunities for wealth. Why do you come to the New World ragged? Why do you come to the New World giving up everything? You come for riches. And these guys expected it, and they got nothing. And they were upset. I'm definitely oversimplifying for effect. Using Martin Cortés, who was the son of Hernando Cortés, of course, the great conqueror of Mexico, using this gentleman as a figurehead, they plotted to assassinate members of the high bureaucracy and take control of the colony for themselves. This coup attempt and its significance for understanding how it undermined racial attitudes. What's important for us to think about in this was the extent of the social racial reach of this coup attempt. Martin himself was a Creole, and others involved included prominent individuals of mixed race. Being centered in Mexico City, the plot resonated with key members of government in ways that other conspiracies launched elsewhere did not. Those who were already suspicious about the loyalties of mestizos and Creoles now became doubly so. Except for Cortés himself, many of the conspirators were decapitated and had their heads placed on pikes for all to see. This is a famous Roman tradition going back, put those heads on pikes. There's no better way to instill fear. Don't do it again was the message. Another and perhaps pivotal colonial shock that forced a change in racial attitudes was the growing effect of the expanding population of African slaves. Now, perhaps it's not coincidental that the rise of the mestizo category, so its popularity as a term, despite being a term that actually had an old world history, it's how it resurged in the Americas with popularity. It started to happen as the influx of Africans to Spanish territories increased markedly. In New Spain, for instance, blacks and whites were virtually at parity in terms of their demographic presence in the middle of the 16th century. Nervous bureaucrats noticed that if combined, the mestizo population and all of the coloreds, in fact, could easily overwhelm all of the whites in Mexico. Now, the government had reason to fear. The colony's black population had started to prove restless. There were a number of runaway slaves who may have joined rebellious indigenous communities from as early as 1523. In the northern reaches of Mexico, from 1549 until the 1570s, free mulattoes, vagabonds, and mestizos were routinely combining forces with runaway slaves and Chichimecs, Indians. Chichimec is a generic term used to apply to frontier indigenous populations or wild indigenous populations, given the terminology of the day. So basically what we're seeing beginning in the 1520s and then really between 1549 and 1570 is a deep escalation of the activity of these groups coalescing and really just engaging in banditry and pillaging. Throughout the 16th century, numerous runaway slave communities, or palenques, were established in Mexico. One of them was Canadá de los Negros, which was founded in 1576. Others were founded outside of Antequera, which is in Oaxaca, for those of you who are familiar with these areas, but also lots in the area of Veracruz and Orizaba, which are on the Gulf Coast of Mexico. The most famous of those is the community of Yanga, and you see a statue here that was dedicated to Yanga in the town of Yanga, which exists today. This community operated in the vicinity of the city of Veracruz from the 1570s until 1609, and as some say, it's the first true free city of the Americas. There's a lot of people who are going to debate you on that, but certainly this is one of the early and one of the more successful palenques. Among the alarming events of the 16th century also was not just what was happening in the countryside, but what was happening in Mexico City itself. A group of blacks attempted to overthrow the viceregal government and staged a coup for midnight on September 24th, 1537. Blacks in Mexico City, slave and free, had become aware of Spain's deep commitment to its wars in Europe and believed that if they precipitated a widespread revolt, the Crown had only enough resources to send military-limited personnel to counter that uprising. As would become standard in many of the future revolt attempts that took place not only in Mexico but in other parts of the New World, the conspirators elected a black king. And this person may have indeed had some ancestry, royal ancestry in Africa. It's still under a lot of debate. But what certainly seems true is that this was a head of a religious organization, a religious body that are known as sodalities or confraternities. And so this person was appointed as the leader of this revolt. Ultimately, unfortunately for the rebels, the viceroy had planted a number of spies amongst the slave population, and they eventually infiltrated the plot, such that hours before the rebellion was to take place, numerous arrests were made. Bounty hunters tracked and killed all of the other suspects. The authorities of neighboring towns and cities were quickly notified of possible in-concert insurrectionary activities that might be taking place in their jurisdictions. In the aftermath of the thwarted uprising, such panic prevailed that a decision was made to build walls around Mexico City to handle future potential insurgency. And so that's what you're appreciating now is that construction. Until that time, Mexico City was a wall-less city. Also, the city's residents began practicing siege drills in case of emergencies. The year 1537 also marked the beginning of a stream of legislation that was directed at monitoring and stiffly controlling blacks, preventing them from congregating in groups, preventing them from carrying arms, and these became, in some ways, the seeds, if you will, of a larger system that we'll be talking about over the next couple of days. Now, these are just some of the experiences in Mexico. Similar stories could be had throughout the empire. As belligerent black runaway slave activity increased and as more palenques were founded, runaway slave communities, palenques, were founded, scholars such as Jane Landers, she gave a Huggins lecture, so you probably are deeply familiar with all of this. She has argued that the colonial government may have even considered creating a third republic. And so that third republic would be the Republic of Negros, to provide a space for blacks. New free-colored townships built in the aftermath of Maroon activity or other forms of resistance were emblematic features of this republic. Now, while the existence of this República de Negros was ultimately short-lived, if at all, what did seem to endure more pervasively was a deeper reevaluation of the meaning of colonial racial mixture. As blacks began expanding exponentially, their presence, along with the growth in the mulatto and free black population, all of this expansion started to increase spark deeper concerns over social hierarchy and trying to maintain and prescribe it. Slowly, as we drift into the 17th century, mestizos and blacks came to be seen as somewhat coterminous categories in some instances, groups that were threatening and that needed to be controlled. Now, that legislation, there's a lot of ways you can take it, but this is in a particular interpretation. All of this took place within a context of growing preoccupation with racial purity and with escalating rates of miscegenation. Racial mixture. Its beginnings in the New World spawned a crisis of order. Its creeping growth thrust to the fore existential questions surrounding the meaning of being. Racial mixture's everyday manifestations introduced a proliferation of new visual codes that demarcated human difference, moving scientists, intellectuals, moralists alike to contemplate the deeper meaning of biological markers and biological change. Societies were thrust into the balance during the 1500s. This was a century of rapid and furious change. One of the greatest eras of population contact in human history. Spanish bureaucrats, legal minds, governors, businessmen, and plutocrats They responded to what was happening around them, utilizing the primary lexicon and instruments that they had available. They put pen to page. They reasoned that racial mixture needed greater containment and greater order. As the world the Spaniards thought they knew came crumbling around them at the very same time that they were trying to build it, much like sand slipping through one's hands as you're trying to create sandcastles on the beach. At least me. You might be a little bit more adept at creating those castles. But much like this, the colonial regime tried to rationalize, they tried to reboot racial mixture through reams of written and continually debated legislation known to the world as the colonial Spanish-American caste system. What they didn't know was that this order was fleeting in almost the instant that it was being launched, and that consequently, its very foundations were far from stable. I'll leave you with that today. Thanks. So Alejandro, is it time for questions or? Okay. So I'll take a few questions. Yes, please. And if you wouldn't mind identifying yourself.
I have Emmanuel Echampon, historian, Africa. I've listened engrossed, and this is just a fascinating subject. My question may not be very articulate because I'm still wrestling with it in my mind. I think of earlier empires. Look, for example, at the Roman Empire, and how imperial status found ways to incorporate others from the provinces. And not that slavery was absent or race was absent, but through political culture, through classical education, through imperial religion, people could be almost like socialized into imperial subjecthood and citizenry. And I look at the story you describe and how race and racial mixture seem to have become so important from almost the story of Spanish imperial adventures in the Americas. And I'm wondering whether there's something about the early modern period that wrote race into this equation, or is it the radically dissimilar nature of blacks and Indians that did not allow for more nuanced or more subtle forms of creating imperial collaboration? So it's not articulate, but I've listened in rapt attention, and these are issues I'm wrestling with. So I put it out to you for what they are worth, hoping you can enlighten me a little further.
I don't know how much I can enlighten you, but I think they're worth, those observations are worth a lot. And let me just add to your reflections as they may lead to something. One is that, first of all, what strikes me is that we know that these individuals, these conquistadors, and maybe not so much the conquistadors themselves, but those who came later, these were people who were versed in the classics, right? This was a period, so the early modern period, the Renaissance was full bloom and past, right? These are people who knew they knew of Livy, they knew of the great processes of conquest, and in some ways even fashioned themselves in this way. I mean, it's all mimicry and imitation in some ways, and in order to mimic the classics, to add greater legitimacy to the project at hand. So I'm not sure if the casual or deep reading that was had amongst of the classics at this period, if they were being read to understand the socialization processes of empire that we moderns or postmoderns or whatever we are now, if that same intentionality was part of the project that was going on, especially amongst the casual conquistadors, so to speak. There was a definite understanding that we are like, right, the Roman Empire in some way. Obviously, what was different was the Roman Empire, let's say, there was a deeper intentionality in conquest, almost a prescriptive nature, right? That at least in the more mature empire, I'm less familiar with the earlier years of development as Rome kind of expanded its role in the larger Mediterranean basin, but certainly the more mature Roman Empire, which one would have been reading about, there was a deeper intentionality than some of the earlier, let's say, roughshod processes, if you will, of the ad hoc empire that the Iberians were creating in the New World in the early 16th century. So the analogy is not as clean, and so parsing for the diachronicity, if you will, of what you're saying, I would argue that the earlier empire, Spanish Empire, is perhaps more analogous to the earlier Roman Empire than the more mature, already how do we integrate, how do we, like the Borg, for those of you who are Trekkies, how do we assimilate, those things are, that it wasn't quite there. And there was also, the Reconquista, just the small little thing that took place in the Iberian Peninsula, where let's say Spain had been working out a way in which to deal with others and with the black body and the African type presence. A lot of that stuff was then transposed, not completely neat, but it was transposed into the Americas, and so there were already codings. There were, there's the crusade of the faith. Let's say Roman Empire was, of course, not the Roman Empire in its religiosity was an agglomerative presence, dissecting, absorbing new gods, fitting them onto their table, into their pantheon. And pantheon is the Greek, but fitting them into their world. Right? They didn't care about your God. It fits. That's not happening with the Christian kings. That's not happening with Charles, King Charles. There is a Christian force behind what the Spaniards are doing, which creates a different passion and a different process, in which I will get into tomorrow a little bit. But those are my reflections. I think your analogy and points are well taken, but there are important differences to keep in mind. And I would argue some of the crusading nature, if you will, seeps into the understandings of caste and difference in ways that we will continue our journey with tomorrow, hopefully in a coherent way. It's pretty complicated stuff I'm going to be talking about tomorrow, but hopefully we'll keep it together. Is it Tom?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Wow.
I'm Tom Johnson, and I teach African and world history. Already learning a lot from the first of your three talks. I also encounter the same thing, that students and people who encounter our work think that these categories and so forth are puzzling or even amusing, as you mentioned. But I think you make this quite clear. But I'll just to emphasize some more. They aren't intellectual or technocratic exercises in classification and categorization designed to advance intellectual understanding. They're about power and the exercise of power. Who has the power to create, maintain, and blur the categories? And there are also tools for exercising that power too. And it's worth remembering that empires are about power, and anybody these days who thinks that America can or should be an empire has better keep that in mind, I think.
I think you're absolutely right. Thanks you for that addition, and that's indeed one of the things that I'm trying to convey. There's a power logic, if you will, that knits this stuff together. But there's also a phrase, at least in the paintings, that I think that I will never forget that Stuart Short said in that 2002 lecture, and that is, at least in the paintings, these are also postcards of empire. So it's about power, but it's also about something else that is happening in this early modern period amongst the elite, and that is an acquisitiveness, a collection mentality, if you will, a desire to to view, to know, to see, and to order in that way. But it's raw physical power, but it's also kind of an intellectual imagining of, this is part of my world, right? That salon type power, if you will, that's also part of this. I think that's also something else to keep in mind, is that power has many shades, many angles, and it's brute, but it also it occupies an intellectual space that it colonizes the mind of those who are exercising that power. And so the Caste paintings, to me, are a representation of that particular shade. Thank you, Tom. And it's good to see you again after, 25 years of it's been that. Yeah, it's only 15 years. Yeah.
Marcus Ramston, a layperson, and I'm wondering, the indigenous and the Africans, apart from individual practices of miscegenation, and apart from their relationship to white Spaniards in a hierarchy, did they see themselves as part of groups in did indigenous people see themselves as part of a group in competition with Africans, whether for favor or money, or did they see themselves as potential allies in overthrowing the white invaders? And I hope this isn't too off topic, but I'm wondering how decimated through maybe germ warfare, since that's been in the news in Western Massachusetts lately, how much was there an economic necessity to import Africans into Mexico? And I know you don't need to necessarily drive down the wages of slaves, but maybe that was in some way a tool to import another working population?
Those are excellent questions. So let me deal with your first question first, and that is the idea of competition versus coalition between Africans and natives. And as a good historian must say, it all depends. Right? And so there you find instances of both, and that's why I say it. It depends on circumstance, geography, and timing. There are places where, especially in Mexico, which is the place that I know very well, there are places in outside of urban areas where you have free black populations that are trying to find their way. And I'm thinking mainly about the 1500s, early 1600s. And they are finding themselves in native communities that are really in free fall in terms of what's happening in demographic decline. Now, to tack on your second question, you're looking at about numbers anywhere between 20 million to 2.2 million over the course of over the 1500s in Mexico from the demise of the indigenous population. So entire communities are vanishing. There are some where there are very few people left, and in these places you're having roaming free black populations and some runaway slaves finding alliances that they can build in those circumstances of communities that are themselves becoming decimated and reconfigured, and so that's the kind of the landscape that you're finding in a Mexico. And in this situation, you're finding a lot of collaboration. And that is a big story of this period. You're also finding, quite frankly, slave populations that are being used by masters to basically overlord the indigenous population. So you have a lot of absentee masters in really throughout colonial Latin America, in places like some of the rural parts of Mexico. There are places in Costa Rica and Guatemala. I know there's Kate in the room somewhere. But there are places where masters prefer to be downtown in the city and going to the ballet or doing these types of things. And they'll let some slaves run their estates and bring the money to them when it's convenient. In that situation, you've got an overlord situation, and that's more of a power situation. You also have instances where these blacks, free, enslaved, runaways, who are finding themselves coming into these native communities, sometimes are, as I mentioned just briefly in passing at the very beginning of the lecture, finding themselves muscle their way to become native lords. And so they become leaders of communities of indigenous populations because they may know Spanish, they may know certain things that they broker for the benefit of their communities. And so those are other phenomena that you are finding. It is a dynamic and complex situation, I guess is what I'm trying to articulate to you. And it's not as easy as any of those categories that you've neatly defined because there's so much variation. But those are some of the general contours. In urban areas, you often find because of the traza, you find indigenous populations living in certain neighborhoods, black populations tending to populate actually the internal parts of that traza as domestic laborers, etc. But as interracial mixture happens, the traza has to become reconfigured. Where are these people going to live? Okay? They're not going to live downtown, smack downtown with other whites. So then you start having complicated multi-ethnic and multi-racial peripheries in the traza where they become contact zones for native populations, black populations, and then the rising mestizo and mulatto populations that become forces in and of themselves. So that's, in a nutshell, some of the complexities that you encounter in this world at this time. Yes.
Hi, my name is Laura Correa Ochoa. I'm a PhD student here in Latin American history. And
again, your name is Ara?
Laura Correa.
Laura.
And I have a question as to, so for example, Joan Rappaport says that it's hard to sort of apply the idea of the caste system or even the paintings to Nueva Granada, for example. So how do we, for example, I'm just curious as to, in this early moment of conquest, how's the experience of conquest in Mexico versus the experience earlier on in the Inca Empire sort of inform the dynamics of how las dos repúblicas are constructed, and to what extent does that alter our ability to sort of import the experience of Mexico later on to Nueva Granada or to other parts of Latin America?
That's a very complicated question. I might have to return to you for some additional clarity, but let me say that her argument is an interesting one. It's one that I will tackle somewhat tomorrow about, what does this, first of all, what does casta mean? Can we use it? Should we use it? What's going on in its evolution? Those are questions that I will get into tomorrow for those of you who are able to return. Your other question, if you could put it to me one more time, but if you allow me to at least get started again, you're suggesting the pre-conquest experience in Mexico.
I mean more, for example, like when you talk about empire, we assume a very cohesive sort of empire, and an empire that knows what it's doing and is usually improvising a lot of the time. And I suspect it will also apply to the construction and articulation of La República de Indios. So I'm just wondering to what extent the experiences of Mexico and the experiences in the conquest of the Inca Empire altered that creation, and because the dynamics were somewhat different, and the economic necessities in Mexico for African labor were very different than, for example, in Cartagena, right? So how do those experiences allow you to make an argument for the casta system all in Latin America?
Again, incredibly rich question. I see why you're a PhD student here at Harvard. I'm not going to satisfy your answer. I invite you to explore some of those channels of research as a student. But let me just put this out there. One of the things that I think, the way I see empire operating in the early colonial period, this initial century, is there is so much that's happening on the ground. As you mentioned, things are being created as they go. A lot of stuff is, as I mentioned earlier, stuff's being retrofitted back. There's a lot of leeway and latitude that's being given to administrators, especially those early years in the beginning of the 1530s and 40s, at least in Mexico. You see some efforts to try to strengthen and tighten things. But I see this as and some of this stuff, and you're talking about Cartagena and other parts where it's debatable to exactly when some of these regions are truly becoming more than nominally linked in imperial systems. So what we do with that, and how that also forms a background to caste is an important question that I don't have a satisfying answer for you right now, because I haven't quite thought about it in that particular way. But maybe I can think about it a little bit tonight and give you give you a better response tomorrow in the context of the lecture. I'm going to have to rewrite a few pages expressly for you. But thank you, thank you for that.
Ben, thank you for a wonderful lecture. You touched on an issue which I think is a genuine puzzle, and I wanted to hear your thoughts about this. And that is how Africans and people of African descent relate to the structure of the repúblicas, right? The tremendous ambiguities that surround people of African descent. In some areas, they seem to be gente de razón. They are subjects.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
It is, but
Okay. Maybe I'm talking to. So, in some ways, they're gente de razón, right? They are subjects of the Inquisition. In some other ways, obviously, they're not. And perhaps this is just a research question. It's something that we just need to research systematically. But I would love to hear your thoughts about this. The other thing I wanted to mention is if you see any alternatives to telling this story about racial mixing. We always tell this story as the history of something of a failure, right? Something that there was some grand design that didn't quite work, and that's your metaphor of the sandcastle. Is there an alternative that we should be thinking about how to think about this?
Alejandro, I couldn't have planted you better in this discussion. I actually don't think this was a failure. I think the way things got started and the way that the Spaniards started to grapple with these issues created what I think is the inheritance to Mestizaje. So I actually think things are far more generative, and so that's where I'm going with all of this. I haven't, because it is, although it is 3 days of lectures, it's still not the entire thought. That I can't complete that thought even in these lectures, but that is the essence of what I've been trying to work on for 14 years now. I think there's a new chapter that we haven't told, but because we focus so much on the fragmentation processes that take place. So I agree, and I don't want to give it all away, but I actually think that there's something else there.
Are you going to be talking about the repúblicas and Africans in the next couple of days too?
I'm going to leave the repúblicas. Basically, I'll preview what tomorrow and the following are about. So tomorrow I'm going to talk about the evolution of Caste and its context. And then I'll start to get at the concept that I think we need to be thinking about that is more generative. And so I'll leave it at that. Before Mestizaje, there was something else. And it's anchored in Caste. And then in the following day, I will talk about those extreme castas that I'm talking about, because I think part of the puzzle has to be studying those extremes. That's how we start to understand the true inheritor, I think, or not true, but one of the great precursors to modern Mestizaje. And that by leaving those extreme mixtures as jokes, we're losing something. And so that's really what the next 2 days are about. So, yeah.
I think we have time for one more. Yeah, that'll be the last one. After that. We have one more.
Hi, I'm Stuart Mimanis. I'm a graduate student in Latin American and Iberian Asian history. Thanks obviously for your tremendous talk. I was really interested by your mention of African nobility in Latin America. There's obviously the very strong discourse on the large number of rights that are attached to the caciques. And this continues right through the colonial period, even as the indigenous nobility, it crumbles, I think, as you said. Is this a strong discourse that's used by free blacks, or is it recognized to any extent by the Crown?
So some sectors of the colonial government, and the best known case, of course, are the gentlemen of Esmeraldas, right, who are seen as true leaders, and by some reports, a nobility. That is, they travel to Spain, they hold court with royal officials. That is a recognized group, but there are others whose nobility is not recognized because, look, it's direct competition with an established Iberian nobility, and so you don't really want that to circulate too far. And so I've seen instances where people who are alleged, as nobility, African nobility, they're sought, and then they're jeered, they're made fun of, all kinds of things that to deflate their position. There are also these recognized offices that one can hold, so the heads of confraternities. So that becomes a sideways space for people who may have true lineage ties or claims in an African context to express that within a safe space, in a New World context. It's clothed in religious security. It's not seen. It's seen with some. It's seen with some authority because of the position, but not on the same level as someone who would be a cacique or someone of that stripe. So those are some of the manifestations that I have seen play out in Mexico. The situations are different in other parts of the New World that I'm less familiar with, but. In the cases that I know from Mexico, those are, these people are not, these individuals who are of royal lineage are not treated with any kind of parity with the cacique in cases that I've come across, or even examples that I know of in the New Spain case.
Well, thank you so much to Ben for this wonderful lecture. And we have a reception outside immediately afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.